Hi everybody, and welcome to Matrix Live Season 5, Episode 6, I believe, where we are incredibly excited to have Matt Mullenweg with us, the CEO of Automattic and founder of Automattic, and also co-founder of WordPress. Is that the correct combination of titles, Matt?
That sounds like a good bundle of honorifics.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. As I'm sure everybody hopefully is now aware, this was a big week for the Matrix ecosystem as a whole, even as Automattic has invested in New Vector, which is the company which myself and Amandine set up back in 2017 to keep the core Matrix team gainfully employed and to keep the lights on to allow everybody to keep working on building out the core Matrix product and platform. We should make it clear that obviously wearing Matrix t-shirts, and this is Matrix Live, and so we're talking about this really from the perspective today of the Matrix.org Foundation, but in practice a lot of the core development, the majority of the development on Matrix is still funded by New Vector, so it's a big deal if New Vector gets a lot more money. So first of all, thank you, Matt, for believing in Matrix and funding New Vector, and for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure.
So I think you've heard about Matrix for quite a while now. We were wondering, how did you find out about what we were doing?
You know, I was trying to rack my brain to remember. I was hoping y'all had part of the answer because, I mean, there was that Patreon early on.
Yeah.
But I don't recall. Did we talk about how I found you then?
Yeah, I think so, actually. So it was in 2017 when we parted ways from Amdocs, who was historically funding us, and we did a big cry for help because we ended up parting ways in such a way that we kind of walked out the door and had no cash whatsoever in order to basically pay people to work on Matrix to continue on it full time. And so we sent out flares, set up, or distress flares I should say, and we set up the Patreon, and it got an awful lot of surprising amounts of visibility on things like Hacker News and Slashdot and Reddit, and I think it might have been through Hacker News that you might have seen us. I don't know whether you hang out that much. I saw you on there yesterday lurking in the comments on the announcement post.
That is entirely possible. I just love open source. And so I spend a lot of my free time just surfing what's weird and new in open source. And I think that probably applies to Matrix in 2017.
Very much.
Yeah.
And I really like when things solve a real user problem, especially if it's one I see in the world as well, and do so in a technically rigorous and intellectually and morally pure way. So those are things that attracted me then and now to the Matrix project. And I also like to think, what if this is successful? What happens then? What does the world look like if 90% of the messages in the world are sent over the Matrix systems, like protocols and everything? Well, that would be kind of amazing, actually. So that's another thing I always liked. Like, if so, you have to think like the dog chasing the car. Like, if it actually catches it, what happens? And I think that a widespread, worldwide adoption of what y'all are working on as a community could be amazing for humanity.
Wow, so no pressure on us then.
Yeah.
In terms of the kind of intellectual and kind of moral purity, I mean, it's obviously something that we try to aspire to. It's something that kind of comes up in different contexts in terms of the balance between the open source side and then needing to find a way to keep the lights on. And I imagine that it's a similar challenge to the one that you've seen in the WordPress ecosystem between how do you get lots of people able to hack on WordPress and sustain it whilst also not compromising the open source project. And I think I'm stealing one of the questions Amandine proposed, but how do you square the governance on the WordPress side where we have the Matrix.org Foundation and then there's New Vector, which is actually paying a lot of the people working on that code to do it full time? Is it the same setup for Automattic and WordPress?
It is similar in a lot of ways. So, um, and I'm actually going to retract the word I said earlier, which is purity. I don't know if purity is the right word to look for. It's a type of pragmatism, actually. So I think that the way that you make it work. Well, first, I'll say that I believe that if you can make a nonprofit community and a for-profit working in concert, where they're strengthening each other, you can create something which is bigger than either would have on its own. And that was really the grand experiment of Automattic and WordPress. There were lots of other open source CMSs out there, you know, Joomla, Drupal, actually a ton more that aren't around anymore. And there were lots of fully proprietary things. And it felt like both were reaching local maximums because the proprietary things were creating really great products, but they lacked the soul of the community.
Mm.
And the community driven things were had a lot of inclusion and a lot of great discussion and debate, but ultimately weren't making decisions and being user centric. They were kind of getting too caught in false proxies or decision by consensus or things like that. So we tried to combine them, and it's been fairly successful. WordPress's market share is more than 10 times the number two in the market, which is also open source. But um, that's a pretty, it's been a great flywheel once we got those things working together. In terms of what's made it work well for us, particularly in the early days, was I've been kind of obsessed with platforms. And typically, for every successful platform, true platforms, the kind of core commercial entity in the platform only makes about 5% of the revenue in the broader ecosystem. And so, if you want to grow a business, that means you actually have to grow the ecosystem way faster and way more. And this is just a weird pattern I kept coming across when I studied the history of recent platforms, like mobile platforms, but even going back to like the launch of Windows 95. I don't know if you remember that, but there
Oh
was
yeah.
like a Rolling Stones song and people lined up like overnight outside of Best Buys to buy Windows 95 in a box. And in one of the press that I think it was Bill Gates did, he was like, yeah, for every dollar we make, $20 is made in the Windows ecosystem. I was like, well, there's that ratio again. There must be something to it. Some sort of law of platforms that says you can't take all the oxygen out of the room. Conversely, where I saw companies and open source projects not go well is when 99% of the development was happening from one company.
Hmm.
This is
Yeah.
actually why it's one of these things that, as part of our announcement, we also announced that Automatic's hiring Matrix developers. And so I would love to hire a few folks to contribute to the project full time and help Automatic's adoption of it, because I think it's really healthy for the ecosystem when there's more than just one company sponsoring it. Today, on a given release of WordPress, we'll have 600 developers and that contribute, and typically about 10% of them are employed by Automatic.
Oh, that's a
Um,
great ratio.
Mm.
I mean, I
you
think
know,
probably at the moment on, say, a Synapse release of the Matrix over implementation, it's probably 95% new vector people working on it. On Riot, it's probably about 90, but then I guess we're slightly different to WordPress in that because it's standards based rather than, well, it is a standard in its own right. What we see are instead completely separate implementations. So there are totally different servers with almost the opposite balance. There might be a few commits from me or somebody in there, but in general, it's all written by whichever that project is, like a Rust server or a C++ server. Or in fact, I think there's a Scala server as well now. So it's ended up being this slightly different granularity of contributions, which perhaps is healthier, but it would be even better if there was a real heterogeneity like you get with Linux or WordPress, where it's just people coming in from all over the place for some of the implementations. Not sure how
you
we
know,
get there.
there's a lot of work to onboard new people, and for us, something we leaned on early on was actually events. Funnily enough, but just think of just like you might imagine. And I know you've done a lot of work recently in your sign-up flow. We talk a lot about developer experience as opposed to user experience. Like, what is the path that someone takes from using the software to finding their way down the rabbit hole or through the wardrobe of Narnia, like to this wonderful world of being active in the community. And we try to have just as many ways as possible, whether it's the forums, the wiki, the documentation, the translation, the all these sorts of ways to get involved. It can be very, very effective.
Mm.
But to go to your original question on what makes it work, there's two things I think are really key that I'll just try to emphasize the community. Um, Regardless of whether it's commercial, non-commercial, profit, nonprofit, um, the two things that really matter are first, being user-centric. So thinking of actually the end users as the goal and aligning everyone around that philosophy. It's so easy, and I still do it today, to get caught up in a technology debate for something which is not the actual thing what you want, which is broad adoption of people being able to communicate in a free, open source, federated, and secure way. Like, if you can bring back, I'm assuming that's your mission, but maybe it's slightly
No, no,
different.
that's basically verbatim our mission, which is
I
reassuring
might
to
have
hear.
bungled it there, but like iterate on that too. Like, what is the thing that really gets to the core of what you want to do, which is different than Telegram or WhatsApp or anyone else could say? What is different about what you're doing that then brings people in as a philosophy? And two, to think long term. I do believe that if you think short term, there's lots of things where people always ask me, like, well, when do you wear your Automattic hat versus your WordPress hat? What do you do when they conflict? And the truth is, try to set it up so they don't conflict. And if they do conflict, it might be a short term thing. There's been so many opportunities over the years where Automattic probably could have made more money that year, but I think it would have made a lot less money over 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's usually just a difference of thinking too short term. If you were to truly think long term and imagine, okay, if we did this, what are the second, third, fourth order effects? 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 30 years down the road. Um, it draws you to the conclusion, which most people would call choosing community. But actually, you're just, as they would say as a finance person would say, be long term greedy.
Yeah, it's definitely resonates. It's, uh, a lot of the discussions we're having internally revolve around this thing. When you have, say, people saying, "Well, we just want more numbers," and then say, "Hey, guys, bigger the ecosystem, the healthier it is, the more everyone can build a business on top of it, and anyone can benefit on it." So that's what we're aiming for. So yeah, it's nice to see that. Yeah, we're not the only one thinking that way, and you guys also have gone through the same exercise. So, why do you think Matrix is important as a whole, aside from the yeah, you were saying earlier, imagine if 90% of the messages were actually going through Matrix, it would be quite amazing.
I think our communication tools have an opportunity to almost, if you could imagine humanity as like a computer, to upgrade the clock cycles, right? Like, if we can increase the interconnectedness of all the nodes and the speed and security of which they can communicate, that seems like a fundamentally good thing for improving the human project. I think communication is at the core of what makes us great and what brings us together. And the breakdown in communication, the myth of separation, is the source of most conflict and suffering in the world.
Mm.
It's interesting because we kind of see a double-edged sword here. That obviously Matrix is a big open network, and on one level, yeah, I think the analogy to kind of just increasing the clock rate of the human species so that people can communicate more effectively is great. But it also comes at the risk in an open network that anybody can get involved. It's all end-to-end encrypted, and people can start using it to communicate however they like. And I'm sure that folks listening to this have roamed around Matrix a bit and found that there are some pretty dark places out there, as well as all of the more constructive ones. And we kind of see this as being one of the big existential risks to the project more than anything else, that you can have almost too much of a good thing, too much openness with too much secure interoperability could kind of explode in your face. You open Pandora's box and the whole thing collapses. I mean, is that... and by the way, I'm aware that we said we'd only take 10 minutes of your time, and we're already double that. So by the way, if you want to escape...
I don't want to dominate your podcast either,
oh,
but this is a fun conversation.
are you okay for timing? Can we continue? Okay, well, let's... basically, I was wondering if you had an equivalent problem in WordPress land or in, say, the hosted WordPress stuff on WordPress.com in terms of figuring out how to provide an open platform without it necessarily being abused for illegal stuff or ending up making the human condition a worse place by letting people work out how to kill each other or whatever using it.
Yeah, there's people who do bad stuff on the internet. I'm not going to say they're bad people, but they can definitely do some things most of society would disagree with. And it's a small percentage, but it's much more noticeable. And in fact, when it's something like spam, the bots can actually overwhelm the network. So I think you need to think from an adversarial view first of if someone were attacking this, if it were very successful, and essentially just call them spammers. Spammers show up. What are the defense mechanisms kind of built in throughout the network that allow the good actors to work together to fight off the bad actors? Blogs, the best part about blogs were comments. Um, Comments early on in blogging were threatening to be completely overrun by spammers. And they were almost a classic tragedy of the comment. They would actually take servers down. They were hitting the commenting forums so much they would overload the sites that they were trying to spam, which of course defeats the purpose because they want search engines to see their comments or people to see their comments. The site wasn't even accessible, so they would break things. But it just shows like it's actually a good analogy for like unfair capitalism. So you have to build in that. Second, you have the problem of just what's the things that are morally odious. For that, I draw a very firm line between what's possible if someone takes the software and does their own thing. You know, you don't hold Microsoft responsible for a document created with Microsoft Word, even if it's a horrible one. Um, you don't, people try, but they generally don't hold myself or WordPress responsible for a terrible website someone makes. Um, but I think you should be held responsible and you should give a lot of thought to what you are promoting and supporting.
Hmm.
So um, if there's a website that's saying, inciting violence against, some minority or something like that, we don't host that. And we won't, if it's using any of our services, we say, no, thank you. We'll move them off, all those sorts of things. They might still use WordPress. Ultimately, the four freedoms of the GPL allow them to still get access to the software. And I ultimately can't control that. But it'd be tough for me to ask one of my colleagues to, as part of their job, support these sites. And so that's ultimately what it comes down to for me. And so it's a little bit of a barbell approach where in some ways I'm a free speech fundamentalist and I fight for that right. But I don't think free speech entails promotion. And that's where I think all the social networks and everything are in a very difficult place, actually. So I have a lot of empathy for the challenges they face at scale with billions of pieces of content every day. That line between what are you just hosting versus what are you promoting? And I would encourage you as well to, to the extent you are unintentionally promoting um, some things which might be a little bit on the edge. Like think about how you can make that require a few extra clicks to get to.
Hmm. Yep. And I think that is a good point.
Yeah. I think there was an interview earlier this week where we heard you mention the pendulum of between centralization and decentralization, and the fact you're thinking that it's switching towards decentralization again, and it's on. So yeah, that decentralization is in the ascendant basically. So why do you think so? What are your thoughts on this?
I think as centralized or decentralized systems become ultra successful, what's made them successful also contains the seeds of their own demise. So when you know, let's call it a Facebook becomes like the social network, which sucks up at some point. Let's call it maybe 90% of all the sort of media being generated in the world. That also then draws in everyone else creating the alternatives. And I think the economic inevitabilities of the commercial self-interest of Facebook in this example, um, growing from that, particularly in kind of like a shareholder beholden system. Um, Also, their success is the golden handcuffs, which prevents them from doing the thing that their users might want or that the audience might want next. So there's been some famous examples of this, and actually, Facebook's been really good at adapting
Hmm.
to where
Yeah.
they created probably the best version. they had this timeline where literally from the day you were born into every significant event in your life, you could program it into Facebook. And it was kind of cool from like I'm a completionist. So I was like, oh, I can really have everything in here. Before I was even blogging, I can put like when I was born, when I moved to Houston or moved to San Francisco or all these different things. Um, and it just included everything. And the natural reaction was people who didn't want everything they'd ever done being documented and accessible. And all of a sudden, uh, private and disappearing media, as popularized by Snapchat, but then I think also just all messaging platforms being very thing that I think have replaced where all the energy that was going into social media has gone. Um, became what people wanted and they needed actually because it was a lot of pressure to have everything be public and seen by everyone all the time
Mm.
and to be judged by the comments and the likes you had. It's so much nicer to communicate with just a small group or even one person and get the reaction of their responses directly without the pressure of the world. Particularly when there started to be some trends of like if you said the wrong thing publicly, there could be really dire consequences. So all those sorts of things came to, I think, be the seeds of the demise, which have given rise to a lot of human activity going other places in the past 5 or 10 years.
I think model almost of it being a kind of dynamic system that is almost sloshing around, oversteering, and then everybody overcompensates, and then they overcompensate again on a kind of 10-15 year cycle. It feels a little, yeah, that makes a lot more sense to me, perhaps, than there being a kind of invisible pendulum that is the heartbeat of the universe, but no, it's just a chaotic system that's randomly sloshing back and forth. Sounds much more like human nature to me.
It probably has resonance amplification.
Yeah.
And there's funny versions of this. Like there's this old law, I think it was JWZ, who actually still blogs today.
He does. It's
He
great.
worked on Netscape back in the day. And
Mr.
his
Zawinski
joke was,
himself.
what's that?
Mr. Zawinski, right? Or Zawinski. I don't know how you
I think
pronounce it.
that's the name. Yeah, I couldn't remember his full name, but I want to say it was him, but he had this law where he said like all software expands until it sends and receives email,
Yeah.
until it becomes an email client essentially.
Yeah, I think he
Or
was
like
writing the Netscape email client to the point where Netscape Communicator got the thing that eventually became Thunderbird into it. He literally
totally.
wrote the first one. And so, yeah, I think it's right. Everything eventually sprouts an email client, unfortunately.
I think I've seen this for Perl as well, or maybe a Paul Graham version for Lisp, where like all every language eventually becomes like a crappy version of Lisp, or
Mm-hmm.
every everything it spans to like it's a bad reimplementation of Perl or regex. Like we kind of reinvent these things over and over again because there's a fundamental need there that for email clients, fundamentally what they were saying was asynchronous direct communication.
Yeah.
That was the principle. And in fact, we've gone kind of the opposite way with things like we've gone, I think, way over indexed towards synchronous communication with
Mm.
Zoom and Slack. And there's a real need in the world for like an asynchronous work communication tool.
God, this is a can of worms which we could talk about for another half an hour or so, or days probably, in terms of particularly our Matrix, how we tried to do something that is both usable for async and for synchronous use cases, even though at the moment it's more about the WhatsApp and Slack style idiom. And yeah, it's a fascinating thing. And also the terrible moment when we added widgets into Matrix. So I don't know if you've seen this, but you can put arbitrary iframes into Matrix rooms, so you can start like embedding a Jitsi in, and perhaps you might embed WordPress, offering an admin interface in, and perhaps you put another thing in before we knew it. And it starts to feel a bit like a windowing manager. And we've kind of created an operating system, and it's just like Emacs again, with everything eventually becomes a windowing manager and an OS in its own right. But I still think that could be kind of fun. But very conscious that we're now completely over on time.
I wonder if Gutenberg blocks could be interesting there.
Ooh, yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's so many things to talk about. Final, very, very
Anyway,
quick
I
question.
love learning about all this stuff. Like I'm still, I would call it a Matrix newbie in so many ways. And so it's been so exciting to get to know the community better and to meet people and see the fun and weird things happening on the different channels. And thank you to both of y'all for just introducing, I think, a really, really interesting community to me.
Oh, thank you again for supporting us and for coming
Yeah.
on the show again. And watch, well, don't watch this because you were in it, but read this week in Matrix, and you'll get a sampling of the highlights of all the weird things that the community's been up to. Brilliant. Thank
Awesome.
you, Matt.
Pleasure. See you.
Have a
Thank
good day.
you.
Bye.
Bye.